The collision almost happened before anyone could breathe. A $4 million warship tore across the water with its nose locked on an American aircraft carrier, closing the distance like it had already accepted its own destruction. It had been sent by Iran, deliberately, visibly, and without hesitation. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't theater. This was steel charging straight at steel. The carrier was supposed to be untouchable, a floating fortress that ended arguments before they began. Its presence alone was meant to silence threats. But in those seconds, something felt wrong. Commands were issued. Warnings were broadcast. Systems designed to control chaos hesitated at the exact moment control mattered most. The mission had been simple: show strength, draw a line, make the smaller ship turn away. Instead, the line blurred. The $4 million warship didn't turn. It kept coming. And as sailors gripped railings and stared at a threat that refused to blink, an unspoken realization spread across the decks. This scenario had been predicted. The risk had been studied. The danger had been measured, because what happened next wasn't part of the script. So here's the question that refuses to sink. If they knew how close this could come to, the first alarm wasn't loud. It was a shift in posture. A radar operator leaned closer to his screen. A contact that had been distant, almost forgettable, was now cutting a sharp line across open water. Fast. Too fast. The numbers tightened. The angle didn't change. On the bridge, binoculars lifted in near-perfect unison. Someone muttered, "He's not adjusting." The words hung in the air like a crack in glass. The aircraft carrier moved with steady mechanical grace. It's massive. A QL carving forward without urgency. It had no reason to hurry. It was surrounded by escorts, layered defenses. Eyes everywhere. Above deck, sailors continued routine checks, though more than a few had started glancing toward the horizon. At first, the approaching vessel looked small. A low silhouette skimming the waves. Then it grew and kept growing. A warning call was transmitted. Calm, controlled, professional. No response. The distance shrank. Another call. Sharper this time. Still nothing. On the Iranian ship, the bow threw white spray as engines pushed harder. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't wandering. It was driving. Straight toward the carrier's path, cutting across it like a challenge carved into water. A destroyer in the strike group shifted slightly, adjusting position, as if testing whether the smaller vessel would flinch. It didn't. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the air changed. The hum of electronics felt louder. Every screen displayed the same converging lines. Officers spoke in clipped tones. Rules were reviewed in seconds. Distances were calculated in heartbeats. The approaching warship was now close enough for the naked eye to confirm what radar had already warned. This was deliberate. A third warning. Blasted across the sea, no reply. Deck crews were ordered clear of exposed sections. The flight deck, moments ago just another working platform of jets and crew, suddenly felt like open ground in a storm. Sailors moved quickly but without panic, because panic wasn't allowed. Not here. Not on something this big. The Iranian vessel altered speed but not direction. Closer. Someone suggested a flare. Someone else mentioned escalation. The word lingered. Escalation meant headlines. It meant consequences beyond this stretch of water. It meant fire. The carrier's escorts began to maneuver more aggressively now, cutting angles, attempting to box the smaller ship away from the carrier's bow. Over loudspeakers, the warning became unmistakable. Turn away immediately. Still nothing. The gap was now measured in seconds, not miles. Through binocular lenses, American sailors could see faces on the other deck. Men standing firm, no visible weapons raised. No obvious surrender, just a straight unbroken line of approach. The Iranian ship's hull slapped against the chop. Engines roaring loud enough to be heard across the water. Inside the carrier, authorization codes were discussed. Quietly, carefully. This was the point where mistakes became history. Every option carried weight. Fire too early, and the world would see aggression. Fire too late, and steel would tear into steel. The smaller warship surged again. A final warning, nothing, and then a shift. Not a full turn, not a retreat. Just enough of an angle to create doubt. Was it adjusting course or lining up impact? The ambiguity was worse than certainty. Fingers hovered over triggers. Orders trembled on the edge of being spoken. The distance collapsed. For a fraction of a second, it looked inevitable. The carrier's bow towered like a wall of metal above the oncoming vessel. Sailors braced unconsciously, hands gripping rails. Boots planted wider. You could see it in their shoulders, that instinctive preparation for impact. Then, at the last possible moment, the Iranian warship veered sharply, slicing across the carrier's path so close that wake collided with wake. White water exploded between hulls. The smaller ship's stern fishtailed slightly before stabilizing. It roared past, close enough for men on both sides to lock eyes. Silence followed. Not the absence of sound. Engines still thundered, radios still hissed, but the silence of something that almost happened and didn't. The kind that leaves your heart pounding long after your body stands still. No shots fired, no collision, but something had broken. Because this wasn't confusion, it wasn't navigation error. It was a test, a deliberate push to the very edge of catastrophe. And in that moment, as the Iranian vessel disappeared across the carrier's stern and the strike group slowly reformed its protective ring, one truth settled over the decks like salt in the air. The line between deterrence and disaster wasn't thick steel, it was seconds. And next time, seconds might not be enough. The aircraft carrier was never meant to feel vulnerable. It was designed to enter a region like a verdict already delivered. When it appeared on the horizon, smaller ships were supposed to recalculate their courage. Its shadow alone was policy. Its silence was warning enough. Everything about it, the towering island, the endless flight deck, the constant hum of aircraft and escorts, projected one message: this is control. The official story was simple. A carrier strike group does not get surprised. It does not get intimidated. It does not get forced into hesitation by a vessel worth a fraction of its cost. Layers of defense ensured that threats were detected early, handled calmly, neutralized if necessary. Protocols were rehearsed. Scenarios were studied. No single reckless move from an adversary was supposed to create chaos. That was the promise. Deterrence worked because everyone believed it would. In briefings, the logic was clean. Presence prevents provocation. Strength discourages escalation. Smaller powers posture, but they ultimately yield. The sea may be unpredictable, but command and control are not. Every captain understood the choreography. Every sailor trusted the system. And then came that approach. A warship valued at $4 million, charging toward a floating fortress valued in the billions. On paper, the imbalance was almost laughable. One represented decades of industrial power, training, and dominance. The other was compact, aggressive, and expendable. The expectation was clear. The smaller vessel would blink first. It didn't. That was the fracture, because the entire structure of deterrence depends on predictability. You show overwhelming force, so the other side chooses survival. You create such certainty of consequence that no one dares test the line. The carrier was not just steel, it was psychology. It was theater backed by firepower. But what happens when someone challenges the theater? When that Iranian vessel kept coming, it wasn't just closing distance. It was poking at the foundation of the promise. The carrier's existence said, "You will not risk this." The smaller ship's trajectory. Saad, watch us. Officially, these encounters are controlled. They are managed. Words like professional and routine get used afterward. Statements emphasize discipline, calm, restraint. The narrative reassures the public that nothing spiraled, nothing slipped, nothing truly threatened the balance. But on that deck, watching the bow of a foreign warship grow larger by the second, the promise of effortless control felt thinner than it should have. Expectation said the escorts would intimidate. Reality showed a vessel that ignored them. Expectation said warnings would deter. Reality answered with silence. Expectation said superiority guarantees compliance. Reality revealed defiance at full speed. The carrier strike group was built for layered response. It was built for measured escalation. It was built for calculated dominance. Yet in that narrowing stretch of water, all of it condensed into a single fragile question. Who turns first? That was never supposed to be uncertain. Deterrence only works if both sides share the same fear of consequences. The official belief was that no captain would gamble his ship against something so overwhelmingly powerful. That no commander would risk miscalculation in open water. That rational actors behave rationally. But rationality looks different when humiliation is at stake. When pride becomes currency. When proving a point matters more than avoiding risk. The expectation was that American presence stabilized the region. That it prevented reckless behavior. That it kept the peace by making war unthinkable. Yet here was a warship behaving as if war was a possibility worth flirting with. And that changes everything. Because if a smaller vessel can close that distance once, it can do it again. If warnings can be ignored once, they can be ignored twice. The mythology of invulnerability begins to thin, not shattered, not destroyed, just questioned. Inside command circles, the message of strength is carefully curated. The carrier is described as a shield, a stabilizer, a guardian of open seas. Its presence signals order, but what the sailors felt in those seconds wasn't order. It was unpredictability. Expectation promised that escalation was always in American hands, that decisions unfolded from a position of control. Yet in that moment, control felt shared, contested, balanced on the behavior of a single approaching hull. That imbalance, the emotional one, not the physical, is what lingered. Because if dominance requires the other side to respect it, what happens when respect is replaced by calculation? When the smaller ship understands that firing first might spark something larger than anyone wants? When it knows restraint is likely? The carrier is powerful, immensely so. But power restrained becomes a variable others can study. And that is the uncomfortable contrast. The official expectation was clarity. Clear lines, clear reactions, clear consequences. The reality was ambiguity. A near collision that was neither accident nor open attack. A challenge that tested response without triggering retaliation. A maneuver designed to probe the boundaries without crossing them, at least not fully. This should not have felt close. That's what makes it unsettling, because deterrence is strongest when it feels absolute, when no one even considers the risk. Yet that day, a $4 million vessel considered it, and acted. And if the promise of control can be tested once in open water, under watchful eyes, with every system alert, then perhaps the promise was never as absolute as it sounded. It should have been an isolated moment, a reckless maneuver, a single captain testing the edge of acceptable behavior. That's how these things are supposed to work. One incident, one correction, lesson absorbed. But the sea remembers patterns. And this was not the first time steel had closed distance faster than comfort allowed. Months before, another vessel had darted too close to a destroyer escorting the carrier through narrow waters. Warnings were issued. Signals flashed. The smaller craft swerved at the last second, leaving only churned wake and shaken nerves behind. Official language later described it as unsafe but controlled. The phrase sounded calm. It did not describe the hands that tightened on rails, or the silence that followed in the command center. The Then there was the night encounter, darkness thick over open water. A cluster of fast-moving boats approached in loose formation, weaving unpredictably. Spotlights cut across waves. Engines roared in uneven bursts. Radio calls demanded identification. The response was laughter carried faintly over static, or perhaps just interference that sounded like it. The boats scattered seconds before. Defensive measures escalated. Again, no shots. Again, no collision. Again, relief layered over unease. Each time, the pattern was identical. Approach aggressively, ignore initial warnings, force, calculation, veer away at the final moment. It was choreography. Dangerous choreography. From the outside, these encounters looked like brinkmanship, dramatic but contained. Inside the ships, they felt like pressure building against a seam. Because repetition changes meaning. The first time is a shock. The second time is concern. The third time begins to feel like testing, and testing implies study. The carrier strike group adapted each time. Adjusted formations, tightened response windows, reviewed communication protocols. Yet the core dynamic remained unchanged. Smaller vessels closing distance boldly, relying on restraint to keep them safe from retaliation. That restraint became predictable, and predictability is a vulnerability. One afternoon, in heavy haze, a patrol craft cut across the bow of an American escort at a distance so close that bridge crews could see individual expressions. No weapons raised, no collision. Just proximity weaponized as a message. The escort altered course slightly to avoid impact. Later reports emphasized professionalism on both sides. What they did not capture was the creeping realization that these maneuvers were no longer rare. They were becoming routine. The pattern wasn't failure in the traditional sense. No missiles misfired, no engines stalled, no catastrophic breakdown. The failure was subtler. It was strategic friction. The inability to stop the behavior before it reached the edge. Each confrontation followed the same script, but the tension increased every time, because the margin for error shrank. Because human reaction time does not improve infinitely. Because one misread angle, one delayed command, one surge of ego could convert theater into tragedy. And still, it kept happening. Commanders knew the risks. Sailors felt them. Escorts tightened formations, surveillance grew sharper. Yet the approaches continued, almost daring the response to change. It created a quiet inevitability. If a vessel charges once, you brace. If it charges twice, you prepare. If it charges again and again, you start to wonder whether the real objective is not collision, but conditioning. Conditioning a superpower to hesitate. Conditioning crews to expect the last second. Veer. Conditioning command to assume restraint will always prevail. That is the most dangerous pattern of all. Because one day, the ship might not turn. And if every previous encounter taught you that it would, if every prior moment ended in relief instead of impact, then the final seconds before disaster will feel deceptively familiar. The sea does not forgive assumptions. And patterns once established do not disappear quietly. They escalate. By the time these encounters began to feel familiar, the warnings were no longer hypothetical. They existed, quietly at first. In after-action notes that used careful language. In briefings where concern was softened into caution. In reports that acknowledged increased risk behavior without assigning blame. Someone had already raised a hand, not in public, not loudly, but enough to be noticed. Officers wrote that the approaches were growing bolder, that distances were shrinking, that reliance on last-second maneuvering was becoming an expectation rather than an exception. Analysts pointed out that repeated restraint could be misread as reluctance, that adversaries learn patterns just as sailors do. These weren't dramatic accusations. They were professional observations, the kind that live in margins and footnotes. The kind that ask for review, not outrage. And yet, nothing changed. The encounters were discussed, but framed as manageable. Labeled as provocations that stopped short of justification for force. Each one, on its own, could be explained away. A misunderstanding, a misjudgment, an overzealous captain. Taken together, they formed something heavier, a trend. Are inconvenient. They require decisions, adjustments, escalation of policy. And escalation carries risk far beyond the deck of a single ship. It invites headlines, diplomatic consequences, questions that leaders would rather avoid. So the language stayed careful. Warnings were acknowledged, then deferred. Concerns were noted, then folded into broader assessments. Recommendations were reviewed, then slowed by procedure. No one wrote, "This will end badly." They didn't need to. The implication was already there. Silence did the work instead. Absence of decisive change became its own signal. A message, unintended but visible, that the line could be approached again. That calculated risk would likely be met with restraint. That pressure would not immediately be punished. From the outside, it looked like professionalism, discipline, maturity. From the inside, it felt like waiting. Waiting for the moment when restraint would be mistaken for weakness. When a final approach would go 1 second too far. When a report written in calm language would suddenly read like a prophecy. This is where the story turns, because failure can be forgiven. Ignorance can be corrected. But warning ignored becomes something else entirely. It becomes a choice. No one needed to order disaster. All they had to do was allow the conditions for it to remain. And the sea, patient as always, continued to test those conditions. For the sailors on deck, none of this felt abstract. It wasn't policy or posture or messaging. It was distance, speed, the sound of another engine cutting across the wind. When the warning calls went out, they weren't thinking about strategy. They were thinking about impact, about steel tearing into steel, about where they were standing if it happened. Some of them were barely out of their teens. Kids from inland towns who had never seen the ocean until the Navy handed them a uniform and a purpose. Others were seasoned, carrying years of deployments in their posture, reading danger in the way a ship moved long before alarms confirmed it. All of them understood one thing in those seconds. If this went wrong, there would be no time to run. On the flight deck, the open space felt suddenly exposed. The vastness that usually symbolized power now felt like vulnerability. There's nowhere to hide on a carrier. Every sailor knows that. You trust the ship because it is all you have. When another hull closes in, that trust is tested in ways no drill can simulate. In the control rooms, hands hovered over switches that had never been used in anger. Voices stayed calm because training demanded it, but heart rates betrayed the truth. Some sailors later admitted they thought of home. Not in words, in flashes. A face, a voice, a promise made before deployment that suddenly felt fragile. Across the water, there were men on the other ship too. Sailors standing on a deck just as real, just as exposed. They had families, they had orders. They were part of the same collision. That never happened. If steel had met steel, it would not have cared which flag flew above it. And that is the part most reports never capture. The cost of these encounters isn't only measured if something explodes. It's carried in the nights. Afterward, when adrenaline drains and the mind replays distances again and again. When sailors wonder how close is too close. When trust and predictability erodes, some crew members asked to be reassigned after repeated encounters. Others grew sharper, quieter, more alert. The sea became something they watched more carefully. Not because of storms, but because of people. Families back home never knew how close those moments came to becoming phone calls instead of routine messages. Parents still slept. Children still went to school. The carrier continued its mission. On the surface, nothing changed, but something had shifted beneath it. Because when risk becomes routine, the human cost compounds silently. Stress accumulates, fatigue sharpens mistakes, confidence blurs into tension, and the next encounter arrives, carrying the weight of all the previous ones. These sailors did their jobs. They followed orders. They held restraint where restraint was demanded. But restraint is not free. It is paid for in nerves, in fear, in the knowledge that survival sometimes depends not on your own actions, but on the judgment of someone closing in fast. That is the real cost. Not the near miss itself, but the understanding that next time, restraint might not save anyone. After the ships separated and the wake smoothed back into open water, the sea looked the same as it always had, blue, endless, indifferent. Officially, the incident ended the moment distance returned. Logs were closed. Statements were prepared. Language was chosen carefully, trimmed of emotion, stripped of danger. On paper, nothing irreversible had occurred. But the silence afterward told a different story. Because unresolved moments do not disappear, they linger. They settle into doctrine, into assumptions, into the quiet understanding that boundaries exist, but only because everyone agrees to respect them. And agreements at sea are fragile things. The carrier continued on its route, a moving symbol of power that still dominated the horizon. Yet, somewhere in that dominance was a crack only visible to those who had felt it. A realization that deterrence does not always stop at steel, that sometimes it pauses at judgment, at restraint, at the hope that the other side will choose not to go 1 second further. That hope is not a system, and systems built on hope eventually get tested again. No inquiry announced sweeping changes. No dramatic reckoning followed. The encounters faded from headlines, folded into the background noise of tension and posturing. But the pattern remained waiting, because nothing about it had been fully answered. Nothing about it had been conclusively stopped. The most unsettling question was never written down. It wasn't whether the smaller ship meant to collide. It was whether the larger one would ever be allowed to stop it. When power chooses restraint repeatedly, it teaches others where the edge lies. And edges invite pressure. Pressure invites miscalculation. Miscalculation invites catastrophe. Somewhere out there, in another stretch of contested water, another approach is already being considered. Another captain weighing speed and distance. Another command center reviewing rules that leave just enough room for doubt. The sea has not changed. The ships have not changed. The question is whether the decisions have. Because if this could happen once, quietly, narrowly, without consequence, how many other moments like it never reach the surface? And when the next one comes, will there still be time to turn away?